Are you ready to scream again? That's a bad joke. I'm very sorry about that, folks. Hey everyone, this is Kevin, the film critic of iCritic.net, and I hope that I don't make myself feel very, very old talking about this movie. So, anyway, there's a new Scream movie out, and it's not called Scream 5. It should be, but it's not, and thankfully the movie addresses that in a very clever way, as is this series is known to. But it's just called Scream, so I guess future generations of moviegoers who want to watch the original Scream on Netflix will be looking up Scream, and then they will probably watch the movie for 5 to 10 minutes before they realize, oh, this isn't the original Scream, this is the 2022 movie, because, you know, that's going to be a thing for a lot of movies going forward. But anyway, Scream 5. Let's just call it Scream 5. Well, actually, let's talk about the original Scream real quick before we talk about Scream 5. So, my history with Scream is that I didn't see it in theaters. I was way too young. No way would my parents have taken me to see this movie in theaters. But I did see it at a young age, probably earlier than I was supposed to. You know the story, or at least 90s kids know the story. I don't know if this is a thing with modern day kids. At a friend's house for a slumber party, parents rented Scream on VHS from Blockbuster. Didn't do a particularly good job hiding it, and they were asleep, so we decided to watch Scream, and it was terrifying. I was freaked out so much, scared the living daylights out of me. Not enough to not see the second movie, though, and when I saw Scream 2, that's when my understanding of what Scream was actually began to take shape. I was a little older, a little wiser. I'm not going to necessarily say I was more mature, but I was watching Scream 2 and I realized how funny it was. In fact, it was so funny it almost wasn't even scary. Even the jump scares and the killings were done in kind of a oddly comedic tone. It made me actually go back to rewatch the first Scream, and that's when I realized that Scream was a franchise that dared its audience to laugh. It truly did. Scream was a comedy masquerading as a horror movie. And the thing is, the people making the Scream movies were legitimate fans of horror movies, and so they basically ended up making a good horror movie, even though they were making comedies. For those of you who don't really understand what I'm talking about, watch Galaxy Quest, which most of you probably have seen. That is a comedy, but it's clear that the filmmakers' love for Star Trek and Star Trek fan culture resulted in them making, well, a good Star Trek movie, even though it was a comedy. And so, from Scream 2 onward, I was a huge fan. And then Scream 3 hit. And the best thing I'll say about Scream 3 is that Jay and Silent Bob have a cameo in it. Kevin Williamson did not return to write that one. That probably explained a lot. But it wasn't as funny. It was still being self-referential, but it was no longer clever, and I was like, well, that's a pretty weak way to end the series. And then they made Scream 4, which admittingly was better. It was better than Scream 3, but it wasn't as good as Scream 1, and especially not Scream 2. So when they didn't make any more, I didn't lose any sleep over it. You know, I don't think things need to go on forever. I just don't. And I think it's always sometimes good to leave the party when people are wanting more. And admittingly, since Scream 4 was good, and you could probably stomach another one, I figure, well, maybe that's a good place to just let it go. But now, we've got Scream, which should be called Scream 5, but as characters explain in the movie, they are in because the funny thing about Scream movies is that they all know they're in horror movies. Somehow, that's one of the things that's great about them. These characters realize they're in a horror movie. They're in a new installment of the Stab franchise, which, for those of you who've been watching the series, you know that Stab is the fictional version of the Scream movies. And they're like, well, we're probably not in the sequel, because it's been way too long for there to be a sequel. So we're in the Requel, which is basically a reboot but it has legacy characters, because if you don't have legacy characters, the internet is just gonna flip the freak out over it. And so, yeah, this is the kind of stuff that I love in Scream movies. Granted, there are still some good kills. Granted, there are still some intense sequences. It's still very violent. I've always kind of wondered how these movies did not get NC-17 ratings, but whatever. I guess it is what it is. And so the new Scream is way more like Scream 2 than Scream 3, and that's the good thing I'm reporting about it. Obviously, Wes Craven cannot direct this movie. He unfortunately passed a few years ago. The directing duties have been passed off to Matt Bettinelli, Olpin, and Tyler Gillette. I believe they directed a movie called Ready or Not, which was another horror movie that had like a little bit of a satirical edge. But that one leaned more into horror, where this one leads more into comedy. But either way, considering that film, they were probably a good choice to direct this one. Now, interestingly, Kevin Williamson is not back to write. He is a producer, and in fact, I even like that there was like a little Dawson's Creek insert as kind of like a tribute to him and him working on the series. But the new writers are James Vanderbilt and Guy Busick, and they did a wonderful job with the screenplay. There's just a lot of idiosyncrasies in here. They do a really good job of, you know, for lack of a better word, bringing in the lore of the previous films into this one in a way that is accessible to newcomers, while also basically charting their own path. There is a lot of things that they're commenting on. They are commenting on toxic fan culture, although not to the extent that some people might be concerned about. So no, I don't believe this movie is woke. It's a pretty simple statement that some fans take their love for things way, way too seriously. And I don't think anyone's honestly gonna argue that point. Even the fanboys. I mean, do you think Star Wars fanboys who surround themselves with action figures and models and fan sites, do you think they ever don't stop there and think, I spend a lot of time on this stuff, don't I? Maybe I should go get a cup of coffee or something. I don't know. I'd like to think they do, because, you know, I'm in a sense an otaku, huge anime fan, love animation, and even I like break out of the mold once in a while. But anyway, so back to Scream. Scream is, look, it's still Scream at the end of the day. You're not going to get like Shakespeare. You're not going to be, this isn't like the deepest thing in the world. It is a comedy that uses horror elements and then subverts expectations while somehow actually doing what horror fans want it to do. It's a very, very interesting series, and I do have to give them props that it's still funny all these years later. I mean, this is the 5th Scream movie, and really, there's only one I don't like, and that's Scream 3. The rest, they're pretty good. I can't complain about them too much, and this is probably the second best one. So, it's currently playing in theaters. I highly recommend it if you like this sort of thing. Now, if you are a fan of the series in general, obviously this is a no-brainer. If you're not a fan of the series, I think it's still pretty fun. If you're not a fan of horror, I would probably still recommend Scream 2 first, if I'm being completely honest. I think Scream 2 is one of those horror movies that people who don't like horror movies can enjoy. I don't know if this is quite that good, but you know. So anyway, let's call this one a day. I am going to give this 3.5 stars. Now, I have not yet written a review of it on my iCritic website, but you are free to visit that site for when I do, and you can also check me out on Letterboxd. And do me another favor, if you like videos like this, I would like to know what you think about this movie and whether you liked it or not, so comment below, like, favorite, share, subscribe, and as always, flame responsibly. Have a good one.